Thanks, Jeremy, for the kind introduction, but probably more importantly as well, the kind invitation to come and speak to you today. I think it's hopefully going to be an interesting session and maybe help spark some interesting thoughts and discussion in either this brief or maybe in future briefs. Just to add a little bit of the context that in terms of what you've already introduced. I'm one of around 40 Royal Air Force legal officers, and as you've said, I'm currently assigned to this role of UK Space Command Legal Advisor. I joined the Royal Air Force nearly 7 years ago, and I have been involved in some capacity in space law going back as far as 2019. And yeah, today's brief is hopefully going to talk a little bit more about UK Space Command from my perspective. As one is a faithful subscriber to the Law, Technology, War Research Cell's monthly space law webinars since their inception, I think back in 2020. This is familiar territory, I'm sure, for those that also sign in, but it's something I think is really important in the context of today's brief, and that is ultimately that the views that expressed during the brief are my own and don't necessarily represent the views of either the Ministry of Defence or indeed the Royal Air Force. Just wanted to put that up front at the start. In terms of scope, addressing the why am I providing this presentation, what am I providing during the presentation, the why, well, I suppose the objective ultimately is trying to enhance shared understanding. And I think comparative studies are important and useful in a domain where we work so closely with partner nations, particularly within the legal community. On top of that, I think with the opportunity to share insights, experiences to date, and seek to forge further relationships across the community is really important. And I think the Law, Technology and War Research Cell's role within that. In terms of the what, Jeremy approached me when I was over at the US Space Command Legal Conference back in March of this year and asked if I would perhaps want to deliver a brief of some nature. What sprung to my mind was that I could probably share my experience as a legal advisor within the UK experiences we've looked to develop our space effort. And therefore, what I'm going to do is try and separate the brief and presentation today up into 3 sections. Part 1, we'll talk about strategy, trying to provide an underpinning strategy of where we've got to in the UK and where it is that we're seeking to go over the future years. Part 2 will then move on and try and pull on some of the threads that exist within the strategy documents to explain how UK Space Command came into existence, what it seeks to do, and what its outputs are aiming to achieve. And then part 3 will look to try and tie in some legal perspective of my experience through that process. So if we turn in first and foremost, and hopefully not too many folk are groaning at the prospect of me talking about strategy, but what I'm seeking to do here really is try and set out the journey that the UK have been on. And for that, there's 4 key documents that kind of come to mind that have been, as you can see from the dates on the screen, relatively recently. These sets out some foundational considerations and explanations between my brief. A point that was well articulated by one of my colleagues a few years ago to me, that one that stuck with me, one that I reiterate quite regularly, is that in considering space, both from a practical and a legal perspective, it shouldn't be considered in isolation. From a national security perspective, there are limitations, for example, in thinking only about the Outer Space Treaty in isolation when we're considering legal points. The same applies to strategies relevant to space. The strategies highlighted in the slide are all relevant. Some are very general in nature, particularly those, the one at the top, the integrated review, and some are more specific to space, and some are more specific again to defence. But I think it's important not to jump straight to the defence space strategy at the bottom without thinking about the wider context in which it exists and the journey that it's been going on. As the slide shows, we've produced a number of strategies since March 21. That's coincided with the establishment of UK Space Command that I'll touch upon. And there's some of the key themes that I'm hopefully going to highlight in the subsequent slides dealing with these strategies that reveal common threads that will be relevant to hopefully the military space community. So if we turn first to the integrated review, it's important to explain what do we mean by integrated. Well, the integration element is the fact that it brings together the topics of security, defence, deployment and development, and foreign policy. So that's the integrated nature of it. And the title of it is A Global Britain in a Competitive Age. It lays out the UK government's vision for the UK out to 2030. It sets out a number of key milestones relevant to our military space efforts, and I've highlighted some of those on the screen. We see phrases appear that become common in future discussions and future strategies, such as the UK being a meaningful actor in space, and also this implicit task that exists to protect and defend our interests in space. We also see some key milestones as well, including to achieve the production of an integrated space strategy. The spoiler alert was already in the previous slide, and the fact that we did that through the National Space Strategy, but it also talks about establishing a new space command. Indeed, the ruling, if we rewind slightly further as well, the ruling party, from a political sense in the UK, the Conservative and Unionist Party, it established in its 2019 election manifesto this desire to establish a new space command, and that can be seen as probably the impetus for this establishment of UK Space Command. But then further down in March 21, we've seen the production of this integrated review reference again to establishing a Space Command. If we then flush through, and you may notice the date again here's March 21. Actually, it was the very next day after the integrated review was published, Defence and Competitive Age was published, which is ultimately the Defence Command Paper. And what that seeks to do is focus on the defence aspect and of that integrated review, and seeks to outline plans to modernise the UK Armed Forces. Again, it touches on space, which perhaps isn't surprising. But again, we see some really common themes and ideas in relation to space emerging within that context. We again see the intent to establish a new space command to enhance the UK's military command and control of the space domain, assist in the coordination of commercial space operation, and lead the development of a new space-based capabilities. It also talks about enhancing our space domain awareness. That becomes a key theme that we see again. That includes establishing a national space operations centre so that we can track, attribute and take action against any nefarious activity. And there's also this further element of developing a UK built intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance satellite constellation, and in supporting a digital backbone in space. Again, we see all these key themes reappearing in the defence-focused aspects of the integrated review. If we then turn, and you can see the date here is moving into September 21, the UK publishes its National Space Strategy, and that's a co-authored document between the Ministry of Defence and also our Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. So a co-authored strategy that forms part of the UK strategic level policy towards space. It echoes, perhaps again unsurprising, the 2021 March integrated review and the Defence Command Papers, and it sets out a vision to protect and defend the UK interests in space. That's one of the key elements of the UK goals, and you can see that hopefully teased out in the slide. And given this is a national strategy, the vision also extends to making the UK an innovative and attractive space economy, growing the UK as a space nation and shaping the space environment. The National Space Strategy sets out four key pillars to support the UK's space ambitions. That includes unlocking growth in the space sector, collaborating internationally, growing the UK as a science and technology superpower, and developing resilient space capabilities and services. Again, the National Space Strategy also sets out a 10-point plan highlighted at the bottom of the slide. And I wanted to highlight 3 of those 10-point action plans that have particular relevance to space. They are leading and making space a more sustainable and promoting safe space operations, delivering the UK defence space portfolio, and upskilling and inspiring the UK's future space workforce. In respect as well, another point to highlight that comes out within the National Space Strategy is again echoing something set out in the integrated review, and that is that the UK will seek to employ what's referenced as an own, access and collaborate framework to guide decisions on how to procure technology, services and systems that we need. And this own, access, collaborate framework is flushed through into quite a lot of the approach that UK Space Command touches on. And I'll highlight some legal observations on that in due course. So if we follow our journey through, the next publication that becomes relevant to us is the Defence Space Strategy. Again, taking on board the National Space Strategy, the Ministry of Defence on its own publishes this strategy focusing on one of the key national space strategy goals, namely, again, this common theme of to protect and defend our national interests in and through space, but also supporting those other goals set out within the national strategy. The Defence Space Strategy includes a more detailed and specific overview of the threats and defence-specific intent, governance and capability development priorities. And it outlines again how our multi-year spending review settlement will be apportioned across our defence space capabilities and activities, and seeks to prioritise them. The whole concept, as the title suggests, is about operationalising the space domain and bringing to fruition some of those elements. So with that in mind, that kind of is the quick run through in terms of the strategy journey that we've undertaken in the UK. We can see some common themes appearing there. And against that backdrop, I'll now look to turn to part 2 of my brief that looks at UK Space Command in a little more detail. Before going into that, I suppose I'm taking a zoomed out version here of trying to explain some of the reporting structures. This is a massive oversimplification of what is probably quite a complex organisation of the Ministry of Defence. And it probably also highlights perhaps the limitations of my PowerPoint skills quite nicely. But what I'm seeking to do here is providing some space-specific context to explain how a reporting structure works within the Ministry of Defence. Internally, we identify that the Ministry of Defence is made up of 19 organisations. That includes our head office, our 4 military commands. You can see them on the screen there. There's the 3 single services, and also UK's Strategic Command. They're led by a 4-star. We also have the Defence Nuclear Organisation. We have UK Space Command, specifically mentioned internally at that same sort of level. And we also have 12 enabling organisations. That makes up those 19 organisations. Really interesting to see that UK Space Command is put out separate there, given that it is a 2-star organisation, and that poses some interesting questions that I'll hopefully tease out in due course. So the Royal Navy, the Army, the British Army and the Royal Air Force, those are the single services. They're each led by a chief who, from a financial perspective, is the budget holder for those organisations, and they're the head of their respective service. So from a financial point of view, how UK Space Command is set out is as a high-level budget that sits under the Air Command top-level budget. So as the word budget suggests, that really deals with finances. We see here from the reporting structure again that UK Space Command, the commander to UK Space Command, reports directly into the Chief of the Air Staff. So as a legal advisor, I think what's really important is always understanding or identifying first and foremost who your client is, and then also understanding what roles, responsibilities, what levers they have, what decisions they can make, what authorizations they have. That's such an important task for a legal advisor, and therefore understanding where UK Space Command sits is a really important task. And we can see that for some certain circumstances, we see that Space Command is seen as a joint command on its own right when we talk about the fact it's highlighted as one of those 19 organisations within defence, but certainly from a reporting structure and from a budgetary perspective, then it reports in via either the Royal Air Force or the Air Command top level budget. that presents, I think, what often is quite a common problem for legal advisors is, or one of the most challenging aspects is trying to work out what those command and control relationships are in the wider sense of it. And that probably offers you some interesting thoughts if you're comparing it primarily to the US system, but also to the other partner nations that may well be on the call today. So with that overarching system in mind, I'll now turn to trying to articulate what UK Space Command is seeking to do and how it seeks to fulfill its mission. So if you want one line, one takeaway line for what UK Space Command seeks to do, I think it's summarised by the top line at the slide there, which is ultimately it's providing the defence lead or the focal point for space operations, space capability, and space workforce and training elements. The UK Space Command brings together these three functions under a single two-star military commander. We're delivering the day-to-day space operations, growing and training our defence space workforce, and then also developing and delivering space equipment programs. It's probably fair to say that it's relatively unique within the UK Defence Organisation for a single command to have responsibility for those operations, for workforce and capability and training. But ultimately, this allows the command to operate independently and dynamically through the requirement setting to capability and operational delivery. Certainly unique from a two-star perspective, the fact that it's led by a two-star. If we then turn to the fact that's what our output seeks to do, what we seek to achieve, the UK Space Command's mission set out on the screen, the highlight and emphasis are mine. But again, I'm pulling on some of the earlier context that I've provided, or hopefully provided, in setting out that it's existing to protect and defend. We've seen that throughout the integrated review, all the way down to the defence space strategy. Again, this protect and defend mission is quite clear for us there. The UK Space Command is ultimately a joint command as well. We have a joint command tag that exists, and ultimately what that's seeking to do, it's seeking to set out, I think, is ultimately that we're staffed by personnel from the Royal Navy, from the British Army and the Royal Air Force, alongside our civil servants and contractors. From the military personnel perspective, the ratio is largely operated on the basis that 70% will come from the Royal Air Force, and then 15% from the other two services, that being the British Army and the Royal Navy. The UK Space Command has also now reached initial operating capability, and it's seeking to increase its responsibility for capability development, as well as it's increasing its responsibility in connection with operations and force generation. However, the dates set out here in terms of UK Space Command shouldn't be misleading, or shouldn't lead to a misconception that the UK has only recently become involved with space. Indeed, our involvement within space military operations can date as far back as the 1960s, and we've become quite an active player, I would say, from the 1980s and onwards. What UK Space Command seek to do was better cohere that element, have a single focal point that can try and cohere, take responsibility, develop all these varying issues that at previous times were spread much more further afield across the wider defence organisations. But that seeks out to set out what the UK Space Command is seeking to do. If we draw down a level then, in terms of the fact that I've set out what the headquarters as UK Space Command seeks to do, we also have frontline units, both of which are highlighted on the screen here, were in existence well before the transfer of responsibilities when UK Space Command established on the 1st of April 2021. And what we ultimately did at that point was on the 1st of April 2021, the capabilities and workforce that existed within the Space Operations Centre at RAF High Wycombe and the Missile Defence Radar at RAF Fylingdales transferred over responsibility for the command and control of those was now with UK Space Command. The Space Operations Centre at RAF High Wycombe, which is the same location as the headquarters itself, is the Space Operations Centre, the SPOC, is the operational unit that conducts space domain awareness and space control missions. The Space Operations Centre coordinates missile defence input from RAF Fylingdales. And if we turn to RAF Fylingdales, their primary mission is part of the US Ballistic Missile Early Warning System. And however, it also provides a secondary mission of supporting the US ballistic missile defence system as well. Another aspect in terms of our structure and how we seek to be space advocates and integrate ourselves across all defence organisations and units is this idea of a space liaison officer network that we have established since our formation. And these liaison officers are dotted across the Ministry of Defence, across all elements of our frontline operational units, seeking to be those advocates for space and also provide some sort of education, collaboration, and making sure that space equities are represented or fully understood by the various different military organisations and units. Turning to the legal support to the command, then I'm currently the sole legal officer within UK Space Command. Much like how the organisation seeks to be a focal point or take a lead in coordinating or cohering the various elements relating to our outputs, I see the legal role as being a focal point as well. So if there are legal issues connecting to the UK Space Command's outputs, then I may not be the single source of authority from a legal perspective. In most cases, I'm probably not, but my job is to cohere, to coordinate with, to collaborate with all the various other legal officers, whether that be in the Royal Air Force or other services, or indeed our civilian servants who are legal advisors across the Ministry of Defence. Then it's seeking to collaborate with them and seek to arrive at the best answer. And what I've experienced, I think, as well, is that as UK Space Command has found its feet over those initial period, and it's sought to transfer or gain responsibility, seeking to grow its workforce, seeking to push forward with its capability, delivery and development, then the legal issues, as those transfers of as those responsibilities have transferred, then the nature of the legal issues that are confronting me are changing, adapting, evolving. So very much growing with the organisation. If I turn next to the UK Space Command's outputs, so this again goes back to or pulls on the thread set out in the Defence Space Strategy. It's setting out some of the strategic themes, what the vision is, what the mission is, and ultimately how UK Space Command is sought to explain or articulate what its functional outputs are against these four key deliverables, four key strategic outputs of operate, generate, collaborate, and educate. And these objectives work around a core underlying focus on people and culture. So I think this is quite a helpful tool for considering how UK Space Command approaches its role. And certainly it's how I try and think about how my legal advice has been provided, what sort of objective are we delivering here, because that helps inform some of the issues that come up, and also make sure that I'm matching the ambition and intent of the organisation. If I just quickly talk through some of these, but I'll dive into some more detail shortly. But when we talk about generate, this is referring to the task of monitoring space, enabling operations and protecting and defending those UK interests in and through space. When we talk, sorry, that's about operate. When we talk about generate, we're talking about building a competitive edge in space capability. We have the strategic objective of collaboration. That's about deepening cooperation with industry, allies and partners. And then the educate is about growing and harnessing our workforce. And with that in mind, I think it's about, from a legal perspective, it's growing the legal community's awareness of space law issues, but also educating operators, policy colleagues and practitioners on some of the legal issues relevant to space. So there's a kind of dual nature of the educate function from a very specific legal perspective. And what I'll do now, hopefully, is use that framework to try and offer you some insights as the legal experience that I've had to date since UK Space Command was established in April 2021. So again, using this framework, I see my role, and it's a role that I've probably forged in close cooperation with my seniors within the Royal Air Force Legal Services, together with UK Space Command as well. It's ultimately about providing legal advice and support to the commander of UK Space Command, and more broadly the command itself, regarding all matters within its area of responsibility. However, I think the focus should be, and has been, looking at legal support to space operations. And mirroring the rationale of the organisation itself, it's about trying to cover all the bases, but ultimately it's a really broad portfolio of work that the organisation has taken on, and that's then therefore reflected within the legal issues presented as well. It's very diverse, but equally it's been quite a unique opportunity, I think, of being appointed to an organisation that's one day old and really being at the heart of how it's forging its path forward, been a key part in some of the decision-making processes about how it's internally structured, about some of the priorities that it seeks to undertake, about informing some of those developments that are taking place as to how we approach our work. And I think that's been an amazing opportunity that perhaps won't be replicated in any subsequent role that I have, but it's been one that I've been really keen to embrace as best as possible. If I move forward through and use those strategic objectives or outputs that we seek to achieve, if I first turn to operate, the commander's direction has certainly been that as we mature, as we grow, as we've passed through initial operating capability on the 1st of April 2022, then operational success must be and continue to be our focal point. And therefore, that probably relates to the legal support and legal input that I provide should really be focused around that operate function. I see, ultimately, I suppose this role is understanding how to integrate space to deliver the best effect for defence, while providing clear, concise and accurate information to senior decision makers in space events, threats and opportunities. And again, from a legal perspective, I'm reminded by what my colleague said to me a couple of years ago about not thinking about space in isolation, either practically or legally speaking. And I think that's true from an operate perspective, particularly. So coming from a previous role when I was the part of the legal operations team within Air Command, I think the legal support provided in that team to Air Command is probably quite different in nature to the operational legal support that I provide to UK Space Command. So for instance, and how I probably would articulate this is that if you consider the basis upon which a military aircraft can enter the territorial airspace of another nation, that's based ultimately on diplomatic clearances. The need for diplomatic clearances has its basis under international aviation law, precisely on the basis that international civil aviation law, the Chicago Convention, excludes state aircraft, which includes military aircraft, from the majority of its provisions. As such, to enter into the territorial airspace of another nation, you need this diplomatic clearance. You need their consent, ultimately. If that's applied from a legal perspective, then the processes underpinning that diplomatic clearance process are so well established, so well understood by operators, that ultimately it doesn't really need a legal advisor to provide them legal input into how that operates. And as such, I think the legal support that you provide in that case is largely not there, because it's just such an assumed process. If we, however, consider some of the other aspects about how space works, then I think that sort of underpinning nature. So if we then turn to the Outer Space Treaty equivalent, which ultimately sets out Article 1 about the fact that space, the use of and exploration of space is free for all states, then I think that's understood quite well within the legal community, that legal underpinning basis, but I'm not sure it's actually fully understood or articulated at the operational level by operators who probably appreciate that's how it works, but they probably don't understand the basis. They're maybe not quite clear in the fact of how that exists. And that's how I think one instance and how we need to approach space law or legal support to space operations might differ from the air domain. And I think it goes back to that familiarity with how space operations work compared to legal operations. And I'll maybe touch on a relevant point to that in due course as well. However, I also want to probably talk, when we think again about legal support to operations, if we pull on this, the framework that was set out within the integrated review that appears throughout all the other strategies that I set out earlier, is this own, collaborate, access framework that exists throughout our strategies. And if we collaborate or access capabilities that, for instance, contribute to the monitoring, enabling, or indeed protect and defend missions that exist for UK Space Command, then different legal considerations are going to come to the fore than might exist under other domains. A big focus in operational output is going to be on commercial law, it's going to be on procurement law issues, it's going to be on intellectual property rights issues, and a host of other issues that come to the fore that might not well exist within, for example, the aviation operations. Aviation operations, the legal links between a state and its aircraft are really probably quite clear and well understood. We have military aircraft, we have a separate register for those aircraft. They're largely speaking owned by the military themselves. They fulfill a military function. It's quite often military pilots that are undertaking those missions. I appreciate there's some nuance probably there, but as a broad brush approach, then sorts of issues that come, well, it's our aircraft that we're looking to use, it's our pilots that we're looking to fulfill the mission that we carry out from the aviation world. If we're talking about space in comparison, if we're talking about this own, collaborate, access framework, then that may well not be the case. It may not be sovereign capabilities that we're seeking to rely upon. It might not be our whole workforce, whether it be military personnel or civil servants or industry partners that are carrying out some of those operations. We may rely on, to a much greater extent, some of our commercial and allied partners, and that introduces some different legal issues. That means that legal support to operations is a bit more nuanced, is a bit different, and introduces different legal issues. And again, I think that's something that's really important to understand. So when we're thinking about it from you provide legal support to space operations, I'm guessing you just look at the Outer Space Treaty. No, that doesn't exist in isolation. It's a very important part, it's a very relevant part, but that doesn't exist in isolation. There's many more legal issues that are relevant. I've probably laboured that point relatively well, so I shall turn now to the next output and offer some reflections on how we seek to achieve the generate functional output within UK Space Command. I've set out on the slide here some of the overarching points related to the defence space portfolio, and you'll recall from a number of the strategies this was referenced throughout. You can see here some of the overarching elements. We're talking about our C2 programme, our space domain awareness programme, space control capability, the satellite communications project, and also the intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance programme. Through the integrated review and the associated spending review that was underway, back in 2021, an additional $1.5 billion, I think it was £1.4 billion of additional funding was provided on top of around about the £6 billion in core program over the 10 years. That was the output of the integrated review. That was the large pot of money that was used from a UK perspective to push forward with our core program of developing our space portfolio. The large majority of that funding, which is set out within the various strategies that I've highlighted, is assigned to this intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance program. And that will look to cohere our existing demonstrator capabilities into a single ISR program that reflects the defence, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance priorities. Requirements will be set. We'll work really closely with UK Strategic Command, but ultimately it will be aligned with a multi-domain integration change program. But that's where the bulk or the vast majority of our additional funding is being diverted towards. Again, when we're talking about some of the generate functions, again, I think some of those issues that I highlighted under the operate output is really key. In here, we're really looking at a lot of commercial law issues, procurement law issues, as to how we really pull through on this own collaborate and access framework, and it becomes very clear as we seek to mature, develop and build upon this defence space portfolio work. If we turn next to the collaborate strategic output, then this slide has a slightly narrowed focus to begin with. And what I wanted to highlight here from this slide, I suppose, is that the similarities, recognising that it's probably primarily US audience on the call today, that there's some really similar strategic objectives, including at the operational command level between the US and the UK. And indeed, I think this sort of collaboration and comparison will be really useful with other partner nations as well. And we've got a really long history of close cooperation on military space matters. The diagram seeks to set out some of those interfaces and interactions between the US and the UK. And I think a point that's often easily forgotten is that the military isn't the only game in town with respect to space. Other government departments are crucial in the domain and crucial to the UK defence contribution. And that's highlighted at the very top of this slide, where we've got the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office from the UK side and its interactions with the State Department. We clearly work very closely and collaboratively on a number of issues with that department, but also a whole host of other aspects. And indeed, it's not just a government issue either as well. There's a whole commercial enterprise that exists with space operations that become very important, and building and engaging and collaborating with commercial industries is arguably even more crucial in space than it is perhaps in some of the other domains. My experience is that the legal communities within these organisations as well, albeit perhaps is relatively small, it is well connected, and I think we have a crucial role to play assisting our respective organisations with their intent to prioritise engagement and deepening our relationship. And I think that's true perhaps of this webinar series, but also a number of the other collaborative functions that we have between the US and the UK, but also our various other partner nations as well. If I then zoom back out in relation to the collaborate function, then this slide seeks to highlight some of the various organisations that might well be relevant. I'm sure I've missed more than I've included, but again seeks to highlight the collaboration with our international partners, but also with across government, but also with partners in industry as well, becomes really crucial. So, for instance, the UK is working really closely in relation to the Combined Space Operations Initiative that you see at the top left there, within the Five Eyes community, within NATO, and also other bilateral relationships as well. The command is also involved and contributes towards the US-led Space Coalition under Operation Olympic Defender, and includes operational level command, space command and control, missile warning, and increased space domain awareness. Looking at it from a UK perspective, then I think the collaboration on the right-hand side of the screen in relation to my role collaborating with colleagues, legal colleagues and policy colleagues within the Ministry of Defence, within our Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, with the Department for Transport and with the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy is really crucial. And a key aspect that we're currently undertaking just now is that within the UK we established a new added to, enhanced and updated our internal domestic licence regulation for space from or connected to the UK. So that is set out now across two primary bits of legislation, which is the Outer Space Act of 1986 and also the Space Industry Act of 2018. There is secondary legislation supporting that, seeking to add meat to the bones, set out within the space industry regulations. And under those regulations, the Civil Aviation Authority was established as exercising all the regulator functions that exist there from the 29th of July 2021. Clearly, we have a really key role in trying to understand how the Civil Aviation Authority is seeking to exercise its functions. And as an executive agency of the Department for Transport, again, we have that cross-government input. So working very closely to understand what that regulation means for the Ministry of Defence, for UK Space Command, which will help inform our engagement with other actors as well. And that's also true, I think, of the UK Space Agency as well, which sits in connection with the Department for Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy, as it seeks to fulfil its mission as well. So we work really closely with all those various organisations, and I think building those relationships is really key and crucial. If I turn briefly to consider some of the educate functions that we've got. So one of my, well, first an observation, and it probably ties into some of the things that I've already highlighted as well, and it's the role that analogies might play. So as we're seeking to grow our defence space workforce at probably quite a fast rate, then we're bringing in people that might not well have a particularly extensive background within space operations, perhaps don't understand some of this, the technical aspects, the operational aspects, or some of the realities that exist in relation to space. And I think that's also true of myself coming as a legal advisor. I'm not sure the legal community is often recognised amongst military circles as being particularly au fait with the technical or operational aspects. But to address some of those, some of that lack of background or experience or understanding, then quite often what's used are analogies, and quite often we see analogies being used of space assets. Think about it and how we conduct naval operations. Think about spacecraft as naval vessels, or think about them as military aircraft. I think those analogies are useful to a point, but certainly coming at it from a legal perspective, then the legal basis underpinning those different systems are very different, are very unique. They're subject to different rules. They may have helpful context. They may be helpful in thinking about how the interpretation of some of the provisions might apply, but ultimately, quite often, it's different sources of law that will apply. That being said, and reiterating again, probably one of my key takeaway points is don't think about space law in isolation. Then we can't think about the Outer Space Treaty as being the only articulation of what law will apply to space. There's a much broader ambit, particularly from a national security perspective, where international law, general international law, whether that be the UN Charter, whether that be the law of armed conflict, depending on what the context is at the time, depending on all those various different bodies of law, how that interacts with space law, how that will govern and apply to military space operations is really important. So we should accept and understand why analogies are helpful, but we should also guard against some of the potentially unhelpful connotations that they draw out. Turning to perhaps a more tangible output relating to the educate function, is that the UK Space Command is currently undertaking a training needs analysis report where it's analysing the very broad brush approach to how we undertake our training needs, how we seek to best deliver them, and how we make sure we can deliver our outputs. And built into that again is also how are we also going to train our lawyers to be able to provide the legal support across this vast array of different objectives. And it sets out there in the diagram the different levels that exist. And I think again my role's been important to that, to try and articulate how we need to also develop our legal specialist understanding and experience to ensure that our personnel can properly advise the UK Space Command in the near future, but also then looking longer term as well. I'll also briefly touch on just now about one of the doctrine developments. You may have seen the publication earlier this month of the UK's capstone publication on UK space power. That's Joint Doctrine Publication 0-40 UK Space Power. We previously had in the UK a joint doctrine publication that covered both UK air and space power in the one document. Those have now been separated out with the publication of 0-40, which is now a standalone. So it's taken out those chapters and looked to really build upon, expand upon, and set out how the UK views space power. It sets out 4 key space power roles: space domain awareness, space control, space support to operations, and space service support. I think that's probably quite important when we think about some of the things that I've highlighted during the slide here, particularly about how the UK Space Command seeks to fulfill its role, how we're looking to develop our space capabilities, how we seek to deliver them, and how it might interact with all those various different space power roles that the UK identifies. And again, another key point that I think is really important and also true from a legal perspective is not to think about space just about the space on orbit segment. The UK looks at it from a 3-segment approach, separating out the space, ground, and link segment. From memory and understanding, I think the US might look at it from a 4-segment perspective, thinking about the human segment. The UK probably captures that within the ground segment, or indeed thinks that it will be captured within the three other segments. But certainly conceptually, UK approaches it from 3 segments. And as we provide legal support, I think it's important to not just think about the space segment, but also think about the ground segment when we're providing legal advice, and indeed the link segment as well. Perhaps not the one that instantly pops to mind. And my final slide of substance relates to the people and culture element of it, which is ultimately the kind of cornerstone underpinning all of those strategic outputs that we seek to deliver. It's really important that we develop a culture. We started from scratch on the 1st of April 2021, or indeed we brought together pre-existing organisations and tried to put them under the one umbrella, the one banner of UK Space Command. There's a lot of initiatives that are underway to try and make sure that we take hold of that opportunity. We build our own culture. It might well indeed be slightly different to how the other single services, or the single services, how they approach it. And I know the US perhaps are more at the fore of this, one because the US Space Force was established back in 2019, but also the fact that that is a service in its own right. So you see issues coming to the fore, such as, well, how do we make sure that we attract and retain the right people within space communities? How should we think about the requirement for fitness for our personnel? So do we really need the people that we're looking to attract to be able to undertake the fitness tests, given the roles that they're going to undertake? I know that's something that the US have grappled with. It's something that I think is very relevant. Cyber is probably the other domain where that's been really relevant, and it's forging its own culture ultimately. Together with that as well, the UK have established its own UK Space Operations Badge, and I've provided some legal support to some of those workforce issues. And again, it's about trying to properly understand what responsibilities, authorities, and decision-making capabilities the UK Space Command have over things such as badge that form forms part of uniform that might well rest at the single service level. And then it's making sure that we make sure we identify those issues and pull them through. As a concluding thought, I suppose I would say that it's been a great opportunity from a professional and personal perspective to be involved with UK Space Command from its start, and it's an opportunity that I have really enjoyed. It's been very varied, very diverse, and probably will continue to be so. But with that, I shall end the formal elements of the brief, and hopefully that has generated either some discussion or indeed even some questions that I might be able to help answer, because I think there's some really good collaboration to be had. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, Squadron Leader Agnew, thank you so much. Wonderful presentation. I think this was extremely valuable. I know that many people here in the US don't fully understand even the United States unique space organizations. And I think having an opportunity to hear from you and hear about the UK's Space Command, how it's organized, what it does, how it works, and your role in it is extremely valuable. So we've gotten some questions flowing in from the audience, both in the chat and in the Q&A. I'll take the Q&A first. First anonymous question. Does one have to be a trained legal professional or a serving kind of military member or military personnel to get involved in UK Space Command? What roles exist for civilians?
Great, thanks. So speaking from the Royal Air Force perspective, because ultimately that's where the current position within UK Space Command is assigned to. It's a Royal Air Force position, which explains why myself as a Royal Air Force Legal Officer is currently fulfilling that role. The Royal Air Force only recruits qualified legal personnel, so that either be they are barristers or solicitors within either England and Wales, in Scotland or Northern Ireland, and therefore the Royal Air Force will recruit only people that are already qualified. We don't offer a route for qualification itself. So, for instance, I was a legal solicitor. I was a solicitor in Scotland before joining the Royal Air Force 7 years ago, practicing in company commercial work. So I had to be qualified, undertake the education process, and then also qualify as a solicitor before I could join. In terms of civilian, so I should also highlight, sorry, that we have regulars and also reserve legal officers. Perhaps in comparison to, certainly I know from the Australian perspective, they have a much greater depth of reserve legal officers than perhaps we do in the Royal Air Force, but it's probably an area of growth that we might see in the future. But at the moment, it's a single post, and it's a regular post that is fulfilled through the Royal Air Force. So it's a military lawyer for UK Space Command. That being said, and I work very closely with a number of civil servant lawyers across government, particularly within the Ministry of Defence, but also all those other departments of government that exist. They are by and large filled not by uniformed lawyers, they're filled by civil servants. So that's where they may well be involved at various different aspects of providing legal advice relevant to space.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from Major Rick Eng from Canada. First of all, he thanks you for a fascinating presentation and says hello from Canada. So Major Eng's question is, noting that collaboration is a recurring theme through the strategies and your presentation, your discussion of relationships with organizations such as CAA and UKSA, what more can you say about relationships between UK civil and civilian space actors and UK Space Command? Has the stand-up of UK Space Command changed those relationships at all?
Sorry, can you just clarify, is it the relationships between the lawyers or relationships between the organizations more broadly, Rick?
I think it's between the relationships between the organizations, perhaps more broadly. Yes, sir.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, first, hi Rick. Great to hear from you. Thanks for the question. I think, yeah, it's been a massive focal point for the command as it's gone through its initial journey. I think it's instantly recognised, and it probably has had to, but it's probably also proactively done it. But the very fact that we've said as our framework approach to this is own, collaborate and access, the very fact that the nature of space operations, the significant role that commercial and industry play with space operations, then it's crucial that we've had to really focus on and develop those organisations. If I could touch on one example that I have been involved in, we have within the Space Operations Centre here at RAFI Wickham, we have since 2020 established a commercial integration cell that exists to basically pull on that collaboration point and bring the commercial actors together with the MOD to try and improve and better understand how we do it. So we've got a set of governing documents that allow a number of those commercial organisations to be a member of the cell, to contribute to operations and work out how we can work more closely together. So a lot of work's gone into setting up those governing documents, and I think we'll see the fruit of those coming to the fore as we move forward and we develop. But as we're looking to develop our space capabilities as well, then we are very proactive in terms of engaging with a whole host of industry partners, and have done and will continue to do so. From a legal perspective, I suppose we've got to then be very alive to the various legal considerations that come to the fore from doing that. So do we understand some of our procurement responsibilities and obligations? Do we understand how best to work collaboratively with commercial actors? Do our personnel have the understanding and background? We're bringing in primarily military operators and then asking them to really engage with industry. So it's really about educating and giving them the appropriate tools to engage with industry on a kind of productive basis so that we can set those relationships off on the right path. So really good point. And I think, yes, the collaborate definitely extends to the commercial actors.
The next question is from Turkalp. They ask, could you elaborate a bit more on the launch collision avoidance procedure standards that the UK SPOC requires? If that's something that you're able to speak about, would you be able to elaborate on those launch collision avoidance procedures?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I probably can't add too much to that, either from a legal perspective, I probably can't articulate it very accurately. So I probably can't really speak to that, other than probably mention the fact that those sorts of procedures probably have an element of foundation in terms of some of the licenses that the CAA, the Civil Aviation Authority, will seek to do in seeking to set out any sort of conditions and seeking to set out how a spaceport license will function, or how launch licenses might be authorised and approved. Then those sorts of considerations are going to be at the heart of those. And I think the Space Operations Centre will obviously be at the heart of providing some input into that in collaboration with the UK Space Agency.
Our next question comes from our own Lieutenant Colonel Seth Dilworth. Says, great job, Stu. Thanks for sharing. On the US side, we've heard a lot about alliances and shared interests among our international partners. From your perspective, do you see any major legal barriers to these alliances, or just international partnership among our military space organizations more generally?
Great, thanks. Thanks, sir. Great to hear from you as well. Really good question. I'm not sure I would probably look at it as hurdles. I think it's probably more opportunity, perhaps, to better collaborate and understand. So, for instance, if we're conducting a UK legal review, then we're probably going to have to understand the UK's approach or interpretation at the international law level, but also the domestic level. And it's important that we understand that. But then if we're doing things collaboratively with other nations, then it's all very well setting out what the UK approach is, both internationally and domestically, but we've also then got to understand and probably one, understand, but also work really closely with our colleagues to understand, well, what's, for instance, what's the US interpretation of those legal rights and obligations, and what US domestic law is going to apply and govern the activity that we're talking about. So I think these sorts of comparative legal analysis is crucial. It's really important. It really needs to be understood. And I think I've heard it said that when you're conducting operations, I think this is true of air operations. When I was out in Al-Udeid in the KOC, it's all very well understanding what the UK rules of engagement might be for the air operations, but you've got to understand what your allies and partner nations are also bound by in terms of their rules of engagement, what legal rules underpin those, what their legal interpretation is. So it's probably no different to that, other than we probably don't have the background. And also I think there's a lot of domestic law issues that really come to the fore that might not automatically be obvious, but it's really about developing these relationships, developing the networks, developing the understanding, and making sure that when issues and activities come up that we're collaborating quite closely. Hopefully that answers the questions. I think it's not so much a hurdle, more just being aware of it so that we can work together to understand fully.
Awesome. It looks like I have one more anonymous question in the chat. This question is, so you had mentioned earlier in the presentation, the UK has been involved in military space operations for quite a bit of time, certainly in a significant way since the 1980s, which is also, generally speaking, when some of the US space organizations, the original Space Command, Air Force Space Command, were created. Main question is, what role did sort of the United States decisions under the Trump administration to, I guess, reinvigorate these space military organizations, right, to resurrect Space Command, to push for the creation of a space force? What role, if any, did those decisions play in the UK's decision to create UK Space Command?
Great, thanks. Fascinating question. So to go back to the 1960s, and I suppose some of our involvement came precisely at RAF filing deals with the establishment of the missile defence radar that was established at filing deals. That is a UK-US enterprise that exists there, and we very much feed into the US system. So that kind of dates back to there. We've got a whole host of other examples that we can speak to in terms of going back. In terms of what was the impetus? I think it's a really interesting question. All these views, I suppose, are my own. I think it probably had some relevance. It probably played a key part. It was probably something that was under consideration in any case. But when you think about how we collaborate and communicate across organizations, across different nations, then I think it's crucial that you can speak to like-minded organizations, like-minded establishments. I see, probably given some of our functional outputs, we're probably more aligned in some respects to US Space Command, perhaps necessarily, than US Space Force. But that being said, I think the focus and attention that we probably generated from 2019 onwards from US Space Command, US Space Force being established, then I think that probably did add impetus to it. I think we're not alone as well. The UK experience, we've probably all followed suit in the US in terms of trying to establish our own commands to have a seat at the table, I suppose, is the way that it's viewed. I think all partner nations, I certainly know Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Netherlands, when it was at a conference last week, speaking with a legal advisor within the Dutch Ministry of Defence, then all these organisations are seeking to be established. I don't think it's no coincidence that they follow on from the US. I'm sure that's added impetus. I think a lot of it is to make sure that we have equal stakes, equities. We have organisations that can talk to each other easily, and I'm sure that was part of the thinking. But a number of reviews were conducted within the UK as well. So there were reports dated around 2018 that looked about our reliance on the global navigation systems, GNSS, from 2018, that looked at the reliance upon that, and what a day without without that would look like. And I think that probably helped also inform and spark some considerations about how we might want to improve, better cohere, and give greater attention. So I think this experience was without doubt a motivating factor and probably added impetus, but I think there were others at play as well.
Great, thank you. So looking at the chat, looking at the Q&A, don't see any other questions flowing in. I will stall for a minute or two to see if any come up. As I'm doing that, Stu, I will go ahead and thank you again. Really, really appreciate your time today. We really can't thank you enough for participating in the webinar and offering your presentation on UK Space Command today. As I said before, I think this is extremely valuable. I think that we could all, certainly in the uniformed military here in the US, stand to learn quite a bit more about our allies and our partner nations and the different military organizations that comprise our partner nation militaries. And so really, again, thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it. And seeing that no questions have come in during my period of thanks and stalling, do you have any final words before the end of the webinar presentation?
Just to thank you for the invitation. Thanks for the support, and hopefully this and other presentations to follow might spark and ensure that we keep collaborating with each other, we keep trying to understand each other, because I think that shared understanding is crucial to us fulfilling our missions and jobs. So yeah, thanks again, Jeremy.